Okay, let's get started. A number of people come in and has slowed down. So again, welcome to the third in our four-part series on business intelligence, concepts, and Excel tools, getting, transforming, and visualizing your data to drive performance. If you've been with us from the beginning, you know that we started out with some fundamentals of business intelligence, really set up sort of the conceptual framework that we'd be operating from. Last time we did our Get and Transform Your Data, we took a look at the query tools, particularly Power Query or Get and Transform, and demonstrated how you would connect to your data. And I'm going to do a quick review of that today and to get started. But we're going to focus mostly today on data models and data visualization. I think that mostly on data models. I think that we're going to take a look at Dax language, which is the digital expression language, which is really an extremely powerful tool that sits in the back end of this functionality, and I'll be able to show you very simple models of that. Again, this series wasn't designed to make you BI experts. It was really designed just to give you a flavor of some of the tools that are available to you and live on your clinical desktop or your Excel desktop right now. You know, learning objectives, again, to show you what's out there. And today, again, we're going to focus on models and data models that you can create in Power Pivot. Everybody knows the challenge is data, data, data. We have to get data from different sources, bring it into our environment, set up a sort of visualization tool, being able to drill down, slice, and dice, and really bring data down to the level that really informs our practice and helps us make good decisions. I go back to this. I go back to this slide all the time because it really is a process in your organization. You really need to create a strategy, leverage your resources, and work to create a data-informed and data-driven environment. And that requires planning and resources and people, a vision and a strategy. Business intelligence, we've talked about this the other couple of days, and I'm going to pop out to what we're going to do today. So business intelligence tools, the data models. It's really a set of functionality in Excel that allows you to integrate data from multiple tables, much like we did with Power Query, and build a relational data source inside of an Excel workbook. It gives us tabular data to use in pivot tables and pivot charts, but what we're going to focus on today is some of the measures that you can build within your data model that really is the power behind your analysis and visualizations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to start looking at Excel. All right. So I'm starting with a blank worksheet, and we're going to go through really quickly some of the things that we did last time, and then I'll move into the data modeling and the DAX language. I'm going to try to, we had a couple questions last week that I didn't get to, so I'm going to try to save a little bit of time at the end, a little bit extra time at the end to answer your questions. Please chat your questions in. I will be able to then, at the end, be able to get to as many as I can. So, as a review, Get and Transform Your Data. Get and Transform Your Data lives inside of data, and we're going to get our data, and I'm going to get it from an Excel workbook. Again, we are looking at demo data. There's no PHI in this data. These are all made up client numbers, dates, the services, that kind of thing. So the first thing I want to do is I want to connect to my data, which is my demo data, and I'm going to import that data. We walked through this last week. I'm going to tell it which tab in my data source I want to work with. You'll see this little thumbnail of the data comes up, so I can say, okay, that's the data I want to look at. That's the proper tab. I'm going to go into edit mode on this. It's going to begin processing the query, and it's going to open it up in another window. 1 second, I got to grab it and bring it over. There we go. So you see again, the query language sets up a set of steps. Here it defines the source. In this step, it tells me what tab I'm using. In the change the data, it goes through and makes some changes to my data. I'm going to do a couple of the things that we did last time. I'm going to go through and take these two data sources or two data fields, and you'll see that it's a mix of nulls and times and dates. So what I want to do is I want to transform that data. I'm going to go in and make it a data type of time. The date field is already, again, across the top here. You'll tell you what your data fields look like, or what the format is for your data fields. Date, time, alphanumeric. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some of the fields out of here that I don't need. I'm going to point to the field while holding down my control. These are elements that I'm not going to need. So I'm going to go through and just pull these out. Then I'm going to go into my home and I'm going to remove these columns. And the last thing I'm going to do to this data set is I'm going to add a column, and it's going to be a custom column. I'm going to get a dialog box. I'm going to call this duration, and it's going to be a fairly simple formula. I'm going to take the end time, insert it. I'm going to subtract it from the start time. Close my parentheses. I'm going to multiply that 1440 to give me the number of minutes. You'll see that shows me that I have no syntax errors detected. I'm going to say OK. The final step is to go in and transform this data type to a whole number. And you'll see now I have minutes for each of the transactions. So what do I want to do with this? So I have a set of instructions that connects to my data, transforms some of my data, and the first thing so where do I want this data to live? Well, if you remember what we did last week, we merged two queries together. So I'm going to go to my close and load, and I'm only going to create a data connection. I'm not going to bring it into my data model. So I'm going to say OK. So one of the issues that we had here is that in my data, let's get over to that real quick. We had our staff was a code, ST1, ST2, ST3, and we want to stand up an environment which is a self-service analytic environment. We don't want people to need to know what the codes are in the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another query. It's going to be from a file. Do this relatively quickly. I know what the data file is. And again, we're going to go through. I have a tab in there called staff. And this is a really sort of simple field, so there's nothing in here that I want to edit. So I'm going to load it right away. I don't need to edit that. It's just a couple data elements that I don't need to change. I'm going to create a data connection. I'm not going to add it to my data model. So I'm going to bring that in. Then the final thing I'm going to do is join these two queries together, because what I want to do is I want the user to be able to go in and be able to filter the data based upon staff name. So I have staff name sitting in one file, and I want to bring it into my database where it doesn't exist right now. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to combine my two sources. I'm going to get a dialog box. I'm going to take my data feed, my data source. I'm going to use the staff in that file and join it to the staff. In this file, you'll see I'm doing a left outer join. I have a 7406 match on both sides, and I'm going to say OK. It's going to put together join those two, and then I'm going to be required to go in and let my query know which element from the second query I want to be part of my data source. And in this case, all I need is staff name. So I'm going to say OK. This time then, I'm going to go through, I'm going to do my close and load. I'm going to create the connection, but I'm going to bring it into my data model, which is where we'll be doing the work today. Say OK, and I brought it into my data model. Again, I chose not to bring it into my spreadsheet, so you can't see the data there. I do know that Excel has loaded 7,406 rows, and I'm going to be able to find that in two different ways. One is that you'll see in my menu above, I have something called Power Pivot, which is my data model. But also within my data tools, I have Go to Power Pivot window. Really doesn't matter which way you get into your data model. I'll use that. And so here we are in our data model. This is Power Pivot. We showed this a little bit last time, but today what I'm going to do is walk through the functionality that exists in Power Pivot, and also demonstrate for you creating some really very simple measures using the Dax language. I'm going to show you just rudimentary application of those formulas. I think that this is really where the power lives inside of Power Pivot, and where the learning curve lives in understanding measures and how to utilize those in visualization. So I'm going to give you a really quick overview of that. You'll see a couple things. As you remember, in our query, we changed our times to just be times. Well, when they came into my data model, they came in as a time and a date format. If I don't like that, I can go into here, select that column, and you'll see all I can do here is change the format. I'm up in the top here, and I want to change that format to time. It's not critical. It's more of a visual thing because you can do some slicing and dicing inside of your Power Pivot. You can filter this display, and sometimes I work in Power Pivot a lot of times just to understand what my data looks like. I talked last week about vetting some of your data, and that you can do that inside of this tool. So that is critical, but if you like neatness, then let's go through and change just a couple of those. So all I did was change some of the formats. But you'll see what happened here is that in my original data, I had a code for my staff, which is the far left-hand column. My queries joined, and now in my data set, although that data lives in two different tabs in an Excel spreadsheet, or could live in two different data tables inside of a database, I can now bring them together into a single view that I can then pivot off of. So let's take a look at some of the functionality inside of Power Pivot, and you're going to recognize some of the functionality that we used in the query, but you'll see that it's more rudimentary. Power Pivot originally, as it was brought into Excel, was the tools that you use to connect to your data sources, but it had limited functionality. If you remember the kind of work that we did last week on the query, you have a great deal of functionality available to you to transform your data into a usable format. You have some of that functionality, but it's not as robust. So as an example, you can still get your external data, and you have drop-downs, but you'll see that the options you have for connecting to your data is much more rudimentary. I think from databases in the drop-down and query, there may be 15 or 20 options, and once you're in Power Pivot, you may only get 3. Again, inside of you get these dialog boxes. So in the beginning, before we had Power Query, these were important ways of connecting to your data to begin building your data models, but I find that over time I've shifted pretty much over to the Power Query. You have much more, or you're getting transformed. You have much more power in that system. You can launch pivot tables right from here. You can change your the formatting. You can do some sorting here. You'll see that there's in the Home tab this really very limited kind of functionality here. You'll see that we have a couple of elements over here that I'll get to when I start. I'll show you how to add another data set to this model and how you can actually use the functionality to bring other data into your system. The design, you have very limited functionality and very little functionality in the advanced. So this really is now not truly designed as a methodology for bringing your data, but it is really designed to support the Dax language, the creations of measures, and KPIs that allows you to pivot and chart off that data. But let's add in another simple data set. I can show you how that works. So just as we had codes for our staff, we have codes for our program. Self-service analytics, people should not have to memorize what codes are inside of the data set, particularly when you have a large number of codes. We want to create a crosswalk. So when they filter on data, they filter on common language data that they know from your normal operating environment. So we're going to bring in another tab from our data source, do a data connection, and I'll show you how that is available to you in creating your models. So let's do it from another source. Let's go to our Excel file. Okay, I'm going to do a data connection. You'll see this looks very different from Power Query. Here's my demo data. If you're going to use this functionality, I don't know why they don't default to using the first row as column headers. I always forget to do that. Luckily, I remembered that this time. I'm going to do an advanced. It's going to, like the navigation function in query or get transform, it needs to know what tab I want to use. I'm going to use the program tab. I'm going to finish. You'll see it's going to successfully load. There was only 2 records that came in. And you'll see down on the bottom here, now I have my merge 1, which is my primary data set, and I have this program data set. The difference being is when I brought my staff names in through my query, the staff names living in this data table. When I bring it in through Power Pivot, it sits as another table to be able to utilize it within my pivot tables and pivot charts, I now need to join, just as I joined my queries together on my staff ID and staff name, I have to join these two tables together, and we're going to do that right inside of Diagram View. What that's going to do is it's going to show me my two data tables, and it's going to show me each of the elements within the tables. Just as a matter of convention, I put my data tables on the bottom, I put my crosswalks on the top, and it's joining these two together is as simple as holding down my left-hand mouse, dragging that down to the data field that I want to join on, and I'm going to get my data join. You'll notice, I don't know if you can see it, there's a little arrow right in the middle here, and it's showing me the direction that this data join is going. Because this is a one-to-many data join. I have one instance of each program here. I have many instances of each program here. The good thing about joining here is if you try to join in the wrong direction, it will fix your mistake. So we join from the one to the many. So it's a little bit different then, because now what I'm seeing is that I still have two tables. So when I go to do my pivoting, let's insert a pivot table. When I wanted to, if I want to bring staff in, you'll see that now, since I have a data model, first of all, what you'll see here is both of those tables are now available. And so what I can do is when we wanted to bring staff name in, it's already in that field. But if I wanted to bring program in, I have to go down to the program crosswalk table, and I have to bring the unit name in, and you'll see that it comes into the model. So it's a little bit of a different conceptual framework. When you merge your two queries, you get the merged field inside of a table. When you join your two tables inside of Power Pivot, they exist as separate tables, but the way this works is every time I bring this unit name in and access data from let's do that. Let's bring this in. So basically what I'm seeing now is that these are the number of minutes for each individual at each of the sites. So it is consistent with your need to provide common language filtering, but they live in two separate tables. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think that it really is a style in how you develop. I used to develop almost exclusively inside of Power Pivot. I do mostly all of my get and transform inside of the Power Query. So here's our data model. So one of the things I want to focus on for most of the time we have available is building a measure. So building a measure, so here's the problem. Here's a real simple problem that we have is that when I created duration, I created a minute duration. And so remember last week we cleared some of these out. So I have a minute duration, but I really need an hour duration. So I need to transform this cell into instead of showing minutes, showing hours. I can do that in a couple different ways, but I'm going to show you how to do that by creating a measure. So here I have my formula bar up on top. I'm going to create a Dax formula. And the way that you do that is you first create your name of your measure. So I'm going to do billable. No, I'm going to do duration 1 because I'm going to build a couple measures. So I'm going to name it. I'm going to put a colon here to tell it that I'm done naming it, and I'm going to put an equal sign because that's how you start formulas in Excel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sum the duration field. So I'm going to use sum. And you'll see what happens as I start typing in, it takes what I typed in and makes suggestions of, in this case, the formulas that I want to create. So I'm going to pick sum, and you'll see it now shows me my data fields. These data fields are duplicated. I have CPT code here, and I have merge 1 CPT code here. I think a best practice is when you're selecting your data fields for your measures, select the data fields that have the table name plus the field name. It will eliminate some problems down the road. So what I want to do is I want to sum the duration field in my merge table. So I just double-clicked on that, and I'm going to close my parentheses, and I'm going to get a formula down here. I'm going to need to expand this to be able to show you what the result was. So basically what it did is it summed all of the minutes inside of my duration field. So I could then create a second measure. This is a long way to go around to do this, but I think it's a nice way to begin talking about the measure concepts in the Dax language and how that works. So now that was duration 1. I'm going to create my final duration. And so, again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to name it. It's going to call duration. I'm going to put a colon. I'm going to put equal. And then I'm going to say I'm going to use a really simple, I'm going to point to duration. You'll see it enters it into my formula, left-hand click. I'm going to divide it by 60. And I'm going to sorry, I did. Let's see. I have this already in my field. Let's call it. You see, I had a field called duration, so it will not let me create a measure called duration because it just wouldn't know how to deal with that. So let's see if that works. So that worked. And so what I did is I took my 159,000 minutes and I converted that into 2656 hours. Depending on how neat you like to be, you'll see that this is carried out to multiple decimal places. You can point to this field you want, change it to let's change it to a decimal number with 2 decimal places. So now I have a duration in hours. So when I go in and say, well, let's go in, let's do insert a pivot table. Let's put the pivot guy in here. So let's go in and say, all right, I want to know the number of hours provided by each of my staff. So now I have staff name. I can go down and pick that. I can put that in my rows. And now I have a duration in hours, and that can be my value. And now what I'm looking at is the duration for each staff, the number of hours for the time slice that we have data for. So when you create your measures, then your measures become available to you in your pivot table. That's a simple example, and that doesn't really show you much of the power in Dax language, but let's address a little bit more complicated problem. So one of the things that we all tend to look at is no-shows. No-shows eats into our capacity, is pain in the neck, disrupts the clinical process. And so a lot of what we do is we evaluate how much capacity we're using because our clients are not showing up for a scheduled visit. So we're going to create a couple of measures that's going to allow us to do that. So the first thing we have to decide is this is a logic problem. So the way that I'm going to approach this is that I'm going to take all the visits that were no-showed. I'm going to take all the visits that were kept. I'm going to add those two together to figure out what the total N was of scheduled appointments, and then I'm going to calculate what we'll call a show rate, which is the percentage of total scheduled visits that were kept. I know folks are out there going, well, what about cancellations? And we're going to ignore that as today's. You would, yes, need to take that into consideration when you're bringing up your show rate. But for the matter of demonstration, we're going to pretend that that's not a problem that I have to address. So we're going to start with figuring out how many no-shows I have. So let's clear the filters, and you'll see I have all kinds of services in here. But I do have a service code that identifies my no-shows that is called no-shows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a Dax formula that goes through and counts the number of rows in my data set that has a no-show in my service code field. That'll count my number of no-shows. I'm going to use a different formula for this, and I'm going to call this my no-show count. Oops. No-show count. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do equal, and I'm going to use a formula that is one of the more powerful formulas in this that allows you to filter within a measure. So I'm going to use the calculate function. And calculate needs an expression and a filter. It's really outside of the scope of this presentation to talk about what expressions are. So I'm just going to create an expression. And what my expression is that I'm just going to count rows. I'm going to count the rows in, you'll see if you can see this, it needs a table. So I'm going to count the rows in my merge one field. I'm going to close that off. And then I'm going to build my filter. And my filter is going to be my merge field, merge one, service code, equal to no-show. And what that's going to do, I created an error here. What did I do? No-show, calculate. I knew that this was going to happen. I do this on the fly. So I'm going to show you how you get too few arguments to pass to the count x function. So let's change this. This is not what I want. Let's do count rows. Count rows. All right. So basically I'm going to say I want to count the rows in my in my data table that have a no-show in them. I basically said, okay, go count the rows in my merge table for all the service codes that equal no-shows. So what this does is return 1,229. So I basically said, okay, I have 1,229 no-shows in my data field. So now I know what my no-show count is. So the second thing I have to determine is what my kept count is. I use the service code for my no-show, but that's not a good way of going about doing it for the visits that are kept, because I have all these different service codes. I don't want to create a calculate field that filters on 7, 8, 10 different codes inside of this field. So I need to find a different way of figuring out how I can calculate my kept visits. One of the things that I do know is that for each of the visits that were kept, I have a CPT code, because those kept visits haven't created a CPT code. They created a bill. So I know my data well enough to understand that if I go in and count the number of rows in my data source that has a CPT code in it, I can count the number of kept visits. So sometimes you really have to understand your data to be able to build the measures that you want. So I'm going to call this kept visit. And I'm going to do my, I'm sorry, I don't spell correctly. I'm going to go in and do the equal. This one I'm going to count, and I'm going to use, as you'll see as I begin typing, it provides me with all of the different values, or the different formulas. I'm going to count the number of values. Click on this. I'm going to go merge CPT, and I'm going to close my formula out, and I'm going to get the number of kept visits. So now I know that I had 4,961 kept visits. I had 1,129 no-shows. So let's create a simple formula that calculates the show rate. So let's do show rate. Let's do an equal, and my show rate is basically going to be my kept visits. I'm going to close out that parentheses, divided by my no-show count plus my kept visits. I'm going to close my parentheses out. And now you'll see when I open this up, I've got an 80% show rate across my entire data set. That's a hard calculation to make out just inside of a pivot table. You can use VLOOKUPs, and you can use formulas and bring different data elements into your pivot tables, but those really live outside of your pivot tables and outside of your charts, pivot charts. And so what we do is we're able to then create these metrics by using the Dax formula that now live in the data that is available for us to create our pivot tables. So let's think about how we would do that. So let's take duration and hours out of this. So let's go and say instead, so I have each of my staff. So let's bring a show rate in here. So again, we've got a number of different decimal points here, so let's clean this up a little bit. Let's do our number format. Let's do a percentage, 0. Say OK. So now I have my show percentage by individual staff. Well, what if I wanted to then do my show percentage by individual staff by month? Now I can pull my date down into my pivot table, and now I have my show rates by staff by month. And say if I want to go further on my visualization, let's bring in a slicer on staff name. All right, so now I have a slicer. Let's pick one staff. Let's go in here. Let's insert a pivot chart. And let me show you something that happens here in pivot tables. So I have a bar graph, but I really want to do a line graph. So when I say OK, you'll see that it doesn't render what I've expected it to render. So I'm going to go into this pivot chart. I'm going to go into my let's see, where is it now? I'm in the wrong place. I'm going to go into my chart. I'm going to go into my design. I'm going to switch my rows and columns. And then suddenly you have your visualization. I'm going to go in here and add my trend line. And in that period of time, what we did in that short period of time that we were looking at this, I connected to my data. I brought it in. I created a data model. Inside of my data model, I joined it to another data set so I could bring my program indicators in. I created a couple simple measures, and now those measures are available to me when I create my pivot tables and my visualizations. So that's really, in a lot of ways, a very rudimentary kind of overview of how you would use this functionality. Let me show you a bit more robust kind of visualization. So here's a visualization using the same data. But what we have here is a number of different types of data. I have billable hours. I entered their goals. I know what their CPT units are, what their show rates. I know what services they're providing. I can graph that out. I can take a look at payer mix. I can create a visualization at the program level, and I can even start looking at client-specific data. Let's take a look at this data model because the model is different. I showed you before we had some simple connections. Well, here's a much more robust set of connections where we have our primary data and we have a number of different crosswalk tables that we're using to create our visualizations. Another thing that I want to show you is a number of different measures. So there's a number of different measures across different data tables. Some of them are relatively complicated. So in this date table, I have billable hours, I have services, but I have expected services. So if you took a look at this Dax formula, this is a much more complicated formula, but what that formula can do is it can go in and evaluate a table that you set up with the expectations, your productivity expectations for each staff that allows you to change those expectations month over month. One of the things that we struggle with is clinicians become supervisors, or they go to part-time. and the expectations that you may have for them change. And so you're faced with this problem is that you want to be able to have a good visualization that takes that into consideration. So I think I have one of those here. I guess I don't. Oh, here's an example of one of our staff who, our test staff, who went from a supervisory role back to a clinical role. That person's expectations changed. This Dax formula allows you to accommodate that change through a formula, a measure formula. Again, inside of the scope of what we have to talk about, it is really, we just don't the time necessary to show you how to really fully understand and utilize these measures, but they can become very powerful tools for you when you're building out your visualizations. And as an example, should I go over to here and do design, my field list. Here's, look at the field list here. You have all your different data fields available to you, all the different fields that are in there, and all the different measures. So suddenly you can begin layering in a set of data, a set of measures inside of a data model that you can then pivot against and create your visualizations. I'm sure I didn't do this subject very good justice. It's complicated, and from the learning curve standpoint, I really think that this is the hardest piece of this. One of the things that we did talk about last time is that there are tools and training that you can begin utilizing. The Power Pivot Pro, which is up on your screen right now, is one of the sources that I found to be extremely useful. They have two online trainings that you can purchase. You get access to them for a year. It walks you through incremental training on not only how to utilize Power Query, but also how to use Power Pivot, and focuses on the structure of the Dax language. And it really is a sequential learning product that takes you through and gets you to the point where you can begin to build out your data analytics, build your measures and your KPIs, and have a much more robust environment. So at that point, I know that we've got a little bit of time left, so if you have questions, please feel free to chat those in. And I had a couple questions that were from last time that I didn't get to that I'm going to answer. So somebody asked, is Power BI a good investment if we have Excel 2016? I would say yes. One of the things that we did not talk about in this series is the next level of tools that Microsoft has available for you to do your visualizations. I started focusing on the tools in Excel because everybody has Excel on their desktops, and this functionality lives in Excel. There are another series of tools that Microsoft has available for building your visualizations and deploying them to your environment. It's the BI Desktop, which is a free download that really brings together the get and transform, the Power Pivot into a single tool, and has much more robust visualizations. You can build your measures, you can build your KPIs. If you're really going to get serious about upping your game and deploying your data inside of your environment, then the BI desktop is the tool that you start developing with. But I think starting with Excel is a good place to start. There's also their cloud-based Power BI, which allows you to then publish your visualizations to the cloud and control access and make that information available to a wider audience. So those are tools that it's outside of the scope, but those are available. So if you want to move your visualizations or you feel that you have a firm foundation inside of the Excel tools, then I would suggest that you move on and begin taking a look at the Power BI. The other question was, can you copy a query and just change it for a new data set without having to rewrite the query? Yeah, query has the Get Transform has a functionality where you can duplicate a query. Once you duplicate a query, you can go in and just use go to your data connection step inside of your query and go in and point to a different data source. And all the steps will remain the same. The issue related to that is as you begin transforming your data, you're going to be transforming your data from a data table that has unique field names. If the secondary data source that you point to doesn't have this, if you duplicate your query and you point to a data source that's not structured the same way, you're going to get a lot of errors. Because you're building a set of instructions in your query, and they're very explicit. They're going to look to certain column or certain data element names. They're going to look for certain structure, and when the query can't find the structure, it's not going to be able to resolve the instructions that you created. And so I find that duplicating a query and trying to use it against a different table doesn't work well very often, and I end up writing new queries. But inside of query also, there's an advanced feature where you can go in and the advanced feature will allow you to copy and paste the actual instructions, and if you're good at language, you can go in and make those changes at the advanced level, but you have some functionality in that. So let's talk a little bit about, I don't see any additional questions coming through. So let's talk a little bit about the office hours. So what we do have is office hours next week, and what we do is we set aside a time that I'm available to answer questions. And so as you begin about any of the concepts or tools that we talked about in the first 3 sessions, there's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing that. You'll see that on the screen right now is the MCTEC email, which is mctech.info@nyu.edu. If you have a question that comes up between now and next week, and you would like to get that, make sure you get that question into the queue and send an email to that address. I would think in the subject line you would want to identify that it's a question for the BI webinar series, and we'll have a list of those questions to get started next time. The other way that we will also be able to go about doing that is the same way that we've done it for these. You can join our webinar next week, and you can just chat in your questions. We'll be monitoring the questions, and we'll be answering them as we go along. So get back to next week is the office hours will be on Tuesday, November 13th. I will be available from 12 to 1. I would suggest you go through, if you're really serious about this, take a look at some of the resources, begin thinking thinking about where your data lives, how you get data access, what your strategy is going to be, and how you may want to move this forward. One of the things that you may want to think about is sort of doing an inventory in your shops about, who in the organization has some of these skill sets. I have found that if you start looking inside of finance, you're probably going to find some people who know how to do pivot tables and pivot charts, understand data structures a little bit, and maybe you go and find those to see if you can share resources across your organization. Find somebody who has really pretty decent Excel skills, but really doesn't understand the clinical environment, may not have a clear understanding of what the clinical data sources are and how they're formatted, but they really have the skill set. Marry them up with one of your clinical people and see if you can, don't start from scratch. So I had just a question come in the presentation next week. Can you show the basics of creating a spreadsheet tab with multiple graphs on one tab, pulling from the tables which are on the other tables? How to create the dashboard look? Sure, I think that, but depending on the number of questions that come in, we can spend a little bit of time on some of the design. Also, I might have a little bit of time if we don't have a lot of questions come in. I'll show people some quick and dirty the BI desktop, how that looks a little bit different, some of the functionality in there. So I will be available for the entire hour. We can answer any of the questions that relate to this presentation and the Power BI. So I think that although we have a couple minutes left, if we have no other questions, we'll probably end for the day. And again, next week we have our office hours. Please feel free to take advantage of those. If you think of questions beforehand, send it to our MCTech email that you see on the screen. And I hope between now and next week you can get a little bit more into the weeds on this. And Power Pivot is pretty complicated. I give you a very, very brief overview, particularly of the measure language, taking a little bit closer look at that and see if these are really tools that will really help you in your environment. I'll answer the questions you have, and we'll take it from there. So thank you, everybody, for your attendance. I hope you found this to be useful and that I didn't make too many mistakes going through here. And I'll look forward to answering any questions that you may have next week. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care now.